Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome back to our Happy Strong Family podcast. Today, I'm super excited for us to have with us Kulsum Khan. Sister Kulsum Khan has been providing mental health therapy in Toronto for over a decade, with a special focus on addressing the needs of the Muslim community. As a Muslim woman herself, she understands the cultural sensitivity and stigmatization around mental health issues that her clients often face and seeks to create a safe space for people new to therapy. I'll hand it over to you, Sister Kulsum.
Assalamualaikum. I'm very happy to be here. Excited for this conversation.
Me too, alhamdulillah. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself, maybe where you studied or where you got your certifications?
Absolutely, yeah. So I did my undergrad at TMU, formerly Ryerson University,
Yeah.
in social work. So my bachelor's in social work, and then I did my master's at York University. And I actually never wanted to do psychotherapy. I wanted to change the world and do international development. So I spent a lot of time,
Oh.
doing international development and trying to save the world, right? And then I
Yeah.
realized very quickly that it takes a lot of politics to save the world.
Yes.
And that if I could just save, not really save, but if I could just help one person, then I would change their entire world. And so
Mm.
that's when I started to get interested in psychotherapy, and
Yeah.
others always told me I was good at listening. So yeah, that's how I got into psychotherapy.
Oh, that's amazing. I also did IDS in my undergrad at some point,
Yeah.
and I feel like it's really, as you said, very political, very like looking outside of the lens, and it's hard to kind of bring it back home.
Yes.
Every time I did a course, like we'd always talk about other global areas, and then we'd bring it back to Canada. So I love that you're like, nope, I'm just gonna focus here. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How did you get into like doing I guess like this niche of like relationships? How did you decide that I want to work with relationships?
I think just seeing that that was a need in our Muslim community a lot, and then finding that that was a lot presenting concern that was coming up a lot in my sessions, and so I did a lot of research, did some trainings around relationships and different communication styles and attachment around our attachment styles. So learned a lot about that and how do we thrive in relationships. And I think a lot of interest comes from my own relationship too, and seeing my parents' relationship. And a lot of that was from like surviving. They're trying to survive their relationship versus I think our generation now wants to thrive in our relationship,
Yes,
right? And
exactly.
so in my therapy sessions, I really look at where how can we get from surviving to thriving.
Why would someone want to move from surviving to thriving in a relationship?
Because in surviving, we're in a fight or flight mode. What we're trying to do is just trying to exist every single day in the relationship. We're not really enjoying the relationship.
Mhm.
And from in a thriving relationship, what happens is we're having fun. We're enjoying. I'm not saying that every day is fun because that's not realistic in life,
Yeah.
right? But in thriving relationships, we're trying to have fun. We try to enjoy each other's company and learn from each other, grow from each other versus, oh my gosh, what fire is going to come up today, which is very much a surviving relationship.
Yes, exactly. And when you thrive in a relationship, you're actually able to grow on yourself too. And I guess like working on yourself and working on each other, like that's better than going through a relationship where you're just not getting anywhere and it's just you keep getting stuck. I feel like, yeah, that's so fair. So I think especially for today, we're like going to be talking about relationship abuse. So that's like the specific topic. What would you say? Like, what are the different kinds of abuse in relationships?
Absolutely. So there are many forms of abuse that shows up in relationships. Most common that we look at is different sections of abuse is emotional abuse.
Mhm.
There's physical abuse. There's sexual abuse, and there is financial abuse, and then there's spiritual abuse.
Mhm.
These are the different kinds of abuse. And so in physical abuse, it's hitting, shoving, grabbing. That's common forms of physical abuse. For economic abuse, it's controlling where your partner spends your money, not allowing your partner to work, not allowing your partner to have access to family income, giving them
Mm.
an allowance, not really having mutual discussions on budgets. And then for emotional abuse, it's name calling and gaslighting and being being mean to each other. And the other part of abuse is sexual abuse. So doing forcing the partner to do things that they're not comfortable with. It, for, it includes rape and violence sexually. And then the other form of abuse is spiritual abuse, is where we're using religion to control the other partner and to make them do things that are they're not comfortable or not ready for in a religion.
Yeah. I feel like with religious abuse, it's kind of difficult sometimes just to discuss 'cause, like, that's something you would never think about putting those two together. It's like spirit and then abuse. How are you going to put those two words together? But it's true, it happens. So, like, in your experience, like, how would you say like that can kind of come up, and what are almost like the red flags of that?
Yes. So with spiritual abuse, you can see some of the red flags are, forcing someone to wear a hijab when they're not ready to wear a hijab, right?
Yeah.
So in healthy relationships, we have a conversation about where is the partner at about that.
Yeah.
And it's also using scripture. Like a lot of the scripture that's used is, you have to obey me. I've said this, and this is what you need to do. And that's not what a religion really is about, right? It's about let's talk about this. Let's very gentle.
Yeah.
And so it's using even words from the Quran to apply that into something that's not related to what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. And especially with the hijab part, I feel like that's just the start to even more down the line. Like if someone's like, oh, you have to wear something or you have to take something off, like that's both ways. It's like you're forcing someone to do something that they're not comfortable with using Islam. That's so sad and so scary.
Absolutely, yeah. And another thing that comes up with spiritual abuse is this idea about 4 wives, right? You should be okay with this. The prophet did this, right? That comes up so much, right?
Yeah.
And then that's really linked to some of the work that I do a lot of work around infidelity. And where it's so complex,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of Muslim women feel like they're doing something wrong or something bad by not being okay with this, right? And so that's a whole different conversation.
Exactly. That's a whole different level of spiritual abuse. Oh my God.
Yes, yeah, unfortunately.
Because I know there's like certain clauses and certain things that women can say, well, I don't want this to happen in the future. I don't want my husband to get a second wife. But there's probably so much guilt with it because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed that. But at the same time, it's like, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed something, there's still the option for the woman to say yes or no to it.
Absolutely. And there's different layers of abuse that comes into that, right? There's a lot of manipulation, emotional abuse, and different layers that play into those situations.
Yeah. How would you say like emotional abuse kind of progresses? Because I feel like there has to be almost like a place where someone puts their foot in and then it just gets worse. So what are some of the beginning signs of like this is emotional abuse?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes in the early stages in a relationship, what emotional abuse looks like is first it starts with humiliation. I find that's usually a gateway. So making jokes and remarks that are not okay, like you don't look great today, or like that doesn't look good on you, or well, how are you dressed? So those are some ways that it can start playing into a relationship, and then it turns into raising your voice when when people are having arguments, or just when asking a simple question, just going off. With the volume changing. Another thing is name calling. So saying, "Oh, it's just funny. I just said bitch because sorry, I used the word disclaimer, right? Sorry. So I just said that because it was funny, right?
Yeah.
It's not funny." Or I used any other swear words that are not okay. Using the F word is not okay. Even if it's a joke, it's not funny, because jokes can turn really serious really, really fast.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of interesting because I think in a relationship, like you have a level of comfort with the other person. So at some point you're like, oh, I'm just comfortable making this joke, or I'm comfortable having jokes on the other end, or I will say this because it's funny and I think that they'll be able to take it because they're like me now. Because you almost like think of that person as one now. But I guess like because I know a lot of times people, especially nowadays, what I'm seeing is a lot of this conversation around how we're taking it too far. Like we're calling everything wrong and we're putting so many boundaries up. So how can you kind of like clarify that wait, no, there is actually a level to it?
So Tell me a little bit about what's taking it so far.
So yeah, that's literally that's what I've noticed, like as a culture of um like we're not even allowed to joke anymore, like those kind of things. I've seen people
Yes.
say that, and they said that, oh, everyone's always talking about like trauma and emotional abuse or like that kind of thing,
Yeah.
and everyone in this society is quote unquote, why are they so traumatized? So I've heard that kind of concept come up in like social circles, and I'm like, I don't know, I think this is like, it just is a sad way of viewing it, because it's like
Yeah.
everyone has actually gone through a lot, but I think that's sometimes is like a way to cover it too. But yeah, what would you say about that?
I would say that's problematic who's bringing that up, right? That we can't joke anymore. But we're we have to look at it in a way as we that those jokes are harmful. They're hurtful, right? Yes, we should be looking at things in a trauma lens. We have to we have to recognize that people have had difficult experiences in their life. They've gone through different forms of violence in their life. And there's nothing funny about that. And if they require some sensitivity and some compassion and some empathy, they deserve that, right? So not everyone is comfortable with saying, I need some more empathy right now, or, what you're saying is really hurtful to me. So I'm not saying assume what the other person feels, but I think it's really, really important to say things from a very gentle and a respectful way that allows the other person to feel comfortable to reveal things to you, right? That are vulnerable
Mm,
and very deep. And that's where we can have really meaningful conversations and deep conversations that allow humans to come together.
I really appreciate that perspective, because even like with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like
Awesome.
he, even those kind of jokes that are just like, oh, as you said, like name calling
Yeah.
or taking things far about someone's looks or personality. I From what we hear, like he saw some made jokes that were actually like contextually they were funny or like behaviorally funny, but it was never bashing at someone. It was never saying something about someone's looks or their personality. So I think that's a very true point. That's a problem I had too, but I was always like, I don't understand. Like if it's a relationship and there's closeness, then maybe it's okay. But
Mhm.
I do think that you're right that to a certain level, there's those boundaries set so that you can have compassion, so the other person can open up and, have like presence in the relationship.
Absolutely. And I think it's
Yeah.
understanding that what may be funny for you may not be funny for the other person,
Hmm, hmm.
right? So, really, that's where self awareness comes up,
Yeah.
right? Am I self aware? And what am I being really mindful of what you're saying?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. You also spoke about sexual abuse in relationships, and I really, that one is just like, it's especially in the Muslim community. I feel like that's a huge like place that we need to still understand and work on,
Hmm.
because I know that um like even the concept of how can, in a spousal relationship, how can there be sexual abuse, like that's something that people have said. They're like, wait, this doesn't make sense because you've consented. But in many ways it's like consent is a step by step process, and it's like
Hmm.
at every point you are going to have different feelings and emotions. It's important to check in with your partner
Hmm.
about them and not just go ahead and do things without that consensual conversation about it.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think consent is a really beautiful thing,
Yeah.
right? It's important to ask for consent. Just because someone has signed this nikah contract doesn't mean that they've given you consent for anything and everything at any point, right? They're also human. We have to I think separate this objectification of women that comes from this North American worldview,
Mhm.
this non-Muslim worldview,
Mhm.
and really look at what is the Islamic perspective on honoring women versus
Exactly.
objectifying the women. I think many of us have drank that Kool-Aid.
Exactly. How would you give advice to someone like to go about like seeking consent within a relationship, within a marital relationship? Um, like, how does that look like? What does it sound like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say consent sounds like asking just a simple question like, how are you feeling? I think starting with, how are you feeling today? Right? Is it okay if I hold your hand? Or is it okay? And I think some people would say, this is ridiculous. It's my wife. Of course I can hold her hand. But you don't know how this person is feeling right now. Maybe they're really overwhelmed with doing, lots of dishes, lots of laundry. They're frustrated. Their parent is struggling with cancer, or there's lots of things going on, right, in a person's life, and maybe they're just not okay with that right now. So it's asking, like, is it okay if, if I hold your hands, and then if you get the consent holding this person's hand. But that's just a very simple example. I know there's instances where it's implied, but I would say being very respectful, and talking about consent with your partner. Why don't we have conversations, right? Why
Mhm.
don't we sit down with our partners and say, I think consent is really important. This is the new concept I learned on Happy Strong Muslim Family, right? And so,
Yeah.
how can we incorporate consent into our everyday life?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
teach our children about consent too.
Yeah, exactly. I think having that initial conversation is so important. And it's like this is something that you can do, like you can do anytime. It's like you're in the process of getting to know someone. It's like bringing up the concept of consent too. I think that's very important that, consent is something that is important to me in this relationship. We will need to ask, like, how are we feeling and checking in with each
Mm-hmm.
other every single day, every single time that we want to initiate any sort of connection. That's really, yeah, I think that's beautiful.
Absolutely. And something that comes in between that I see so much in my practice, and it comes in between a lot of things, is ego.
Mm,
So because I asked for consent, and by the way, definition of consent is asking for permission, right?
yeah.
And so the word permission is very interesting, right? A lot of a lot of views on that. But when we talk about consent, we talk about um, really, it's like really just allowing yourself to be in the moment, and allowing yourself to create avenues and pockets of respect. That's what we're trying to do in a
Mm,
relationship, right?
yeah, exactly. Oh, that's beautifully said. Creating pockets of respect. Like, I feel like that's just because consent at the end of the day, as you said, it's like seeking permission and it's using it, like recognizing that every single day is going to be different in the relationship. And just because something's okay today, tomorrow it might not be. As you said, the holding hand concept, that's so like so beautiful because there are times where I'm like, I'm also overwhelmed. I don't want to do anything. I just want to sit and do my own thing. So that's very
Yes.
true. Yeah.
And what I was saying about ego earlier is that we think that this has something to do about me, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's this idea now about me. What is the world going to think about me? We're not caring about the world right now. What does
Yeah.
your partner think about me?
Exactly.
Right? And it
Yeah.
doesn't have to do with your identity. It doesn't make you a less of a man or a less of a woman if you ask for consent. It makes you a human.
Exactly. And also, a lot of times, what you're going through and what you say yes or no to has a lot to do with you than the other person. So, even in that concept of consent, it's like if I'm saying yes or no to something, it's because of what I'm feeling or what I'm going through. And it's not what the other person is experiencing. Because I think someone might get
Absolutely.
really like, it's like, can I hold your hand? No, it's like, oh, how dare you offend me? But,
Yes, exactly,
but
right?
yeah,
We tend to take things very personally,
yeah,
and we sometimes forget that this person has autonomy, and that doesn't mean that they hate me, right? It leads, oftentimes our actions lead to these ideas that we now develop about this person. This is how this other person thinks about me or feels about me. That's
yeah.
not true. Maybe they're just having a difficult day or a difficult moment.
Yeah. I know the concept of like bids of connection is really important in relationships, like responding to and offering bids of connection. Like, okay, here's something that I want to connect with you with. Like, let's connect, right? So, how would you say someone goes about like kind of balancing that? Okay, I'm going to be saying no to a bit of connection through this. I'm just curious because I'm putting those two things together.
Hmm.
Like, I'm saying no because I want to, but I also know that I'm refusing connection in this moment.
Absolutely. And I think um, if I've refused a bit of bids for connection in that moment, there are going to be other bits of connection. You don't need to agree to every bit of connection at every moment, right? So it's looking for another moment of a bit of connection, and then even creating that other moment when you're ready with your partner,
Mm,
and maybe coming back and saying, I noticed that after dinner you wanted to connect, and I just wasn't feeling okay, or I just had this really bad news come up about a family member. Can we do something else a little later or tomorrow when I feel a little bit more okay?
exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful concept. And it's very relatable too. It's like there's ways to apply it in our lives as well. Um, I know you also said, of course, like physical abuse, like domestic violence, for example. That's something that we, I feel like as a Muslim community, we definitely need to like work on understanding more and like just like connecting to more. So could you tell me a bit about that in your lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think domestic violence is a very taboo topic in the community, right? It's very shushed, and a lot of it has to do with the cultural stigma around it. So many women and many actually men, we could talk about domestic violence, men experience domestic violence too. I think it's 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence and 1 in 7 men experience domestic violence, but
Mhm.
oftentimes we don't talk about men. So in this context, let's talk about both. And so a lot of times people have a difficult time leaving abusive relationships or stay in abusive relationships because they are financially do not have the finances to leave a relationship. There are many reasons, but these are some of the top reasons. And the second is the stigma. What is the community going to say? And especially in
Mhm.
the Pakistani culture,
Yeah.
we have the log kya kahenge, right?
Yeah.
Or who's gonna marry my child if our family looks very different if um, get divorced and my now I have to raise a child on my own. And then the third is there's a fear. Sometimes there's a fear of the other person is going to hurt me or kill me or hurt my family back home,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So these are some of the reasons. And I think another reason that we don't really talk about is rationalization. So when someone spends years in a relationship where before it actually gets physical, there are different little the red flags that people ignore. And so a lot of that is emotional abuse or financial abuse that starts before the physical abuse. And when that is happening, a lot of times people rationalize that I deserve this, right? I
Mm.
am a lesser person. I did something wrong or I did something bad, or God is punishing me. Thus, my husband is punishing me. There's this a line of thinking
Oh my
sometimes,
God. Yeah.
yeah, that
Yeah.
shows up quite a bit. So there are many reasons why people stay in abusive relationships, and there's different forms of abuse, and it escalates. And I think it's important to see all of that.
Yeah. What would you say is like the mindset for a Muslim to have when they're stuck in a situation of abuse? Like whether as especially now that we're speaking about physical, especially in like the sense of like someone's punishing me, it's because God's punishing me. How can we get rid of that mindset? How can someone get out of that mindset?
Yeah. And I think so. That's a very toxic way of thinking,
Yeah.
and that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is not punishing you. I think that's important to recognize through this person, right? That's It's a very distorted way of thinking, and that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala wants us to. Yes, he this is a trial. Dunya is a trial and tribulation, but He also wants us to be. It's safe and okay,
Exactly.
right? At the end of the
Exactly.
day, so it's important to recognize that there are lots of supports available in the community. And I think NISA Helpline is one of those amazing
Mm,
Muslim supports out
yes,
there.
they're so good.
Yes. And so you're not alone. I think I would say to this person
Yeah.
that you just have to reach out. It's a phone call away, it's a text away, and reach out to NISA Helpline. And then there's also Sakina Homes, Nisa Homes now. So that we're now creating a very strong network for Muslim supports now for people leaving domestic violence situation.
Hmm.
And the best thing to do is to reach out to a safe person,
Yeah.
a person that you can trust, and tell them what's going on.
Yeah. I think even before like reaching out, it's that concept of the low self esteem to be able
Mm-hmm.
to say that like someone, it's okay if someone's punishing me because that's God punishing me. I think that really comes from thinking like I'm worthless, like
Mm-hmm.
I deserve this, as you said. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made everyone with so much worth and everyone is good enough. Just yesterday, I was at a Muslim healing circle and it was run by Canadian Muslim Counseling. And our psychotherapist, she was explaining that like when you like even the prophets like Musa alayhi salam, when he went to when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him go to Pharaoh, he's like, no, I'm not good enough. Send my brother. Like that's what his response was. When Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was told to read Iqra, right? He was told to read. He's like, no, I can't read. But every single time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought someone up to the test, it was so that they're tested because they can get through it.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, no, you're good enough to get through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this situation, when someone is going through abuse, they're thinking that God's punishing me. It's actually God doesn't want you to go through this. You're good enough to rise above and say, you know what, no, like I'm going to put myself first. You cannot touch me like that, or you cannot harm me like that. So
Yes.
there's definitely, that's the right of a Muslim, is to protect themselves. If they're getting harmed, they can put a shield up and say, nope, I'm going to defend myself. So it's that concept of justice that I think many times gets so like trickled out in our community. Like
Yeah.
the fact that there is a justice in Islam, and there is a concept of being able to stand up for yourself and say, nope, I'm going to, do XYZ for me. Like
Yeah.
that's just, there's, I feel like a lot of times in our culture, like Pakistani culture, it's like, oh, put what the elders say first, or put your spouse first, put XYZ first. But like,
Hmm.
what about me? You know?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
Allah is very merciful, right? I think we
Um,
forget that. And there is a saying from the Prophet as well. I think there was an incident, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that there was an incident where a parent was abusing their child, and they were saying that no matter who it is, right? It's not, abuse is never okay. It's
Yeah.
never to harm your body, and it's a really and your mind and your soul,
Yeah.
for anyone to do that. And I think we sometimes forget that our body and our mind is Allah's amana, right? So we have to return, right, to our creator. So we have to keep that in mind, that we are going to be accountable of how do we take care of our amana, right? So that's
Mm.
also very important.
Subhanallah. And if you think about it from that point of view, then God would never be punishing you. He would just be, you're stuck in a situation. He wants you to rise above.
Yes, because we look
And
at trials
yeah,
and tribulations, right?
yeah, exactly. And that can be a trial or tribulation, but it's not a punishment. Well, that's a really important reframing. And I hope, it's helpful for people, because once you can reframe that, then it's like even the first step towards it. Like, as you said, it won't be, maybe it might not start off physical, it might start off financial or emotional. You're like, nope, my mind and body or soul, I'm not going to let any of those be harmed that way. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's really difficult. Financial abuse, I'm really curious about that one too.
Yeah.
I love getting a little bit, because I know much, so you're the expert. What's a little bit about that? Like, how
Yeah.
does that work?
So the financial abuse is, we it comes up quite a bit as well, and sometimes it starts early on in the relationship. And you were talking about some of those red flags in a relationship. So not allowing your partner to work when they want to work.
Mm,
I think that's a big red flag in a relationship, and everything is a discussion at the end of the day, right? So when we there are different kinds of families, and I'm not saying that every family both partners need to work. I'm just going to clarify that now. But I think, when oftentimes that comes up is when a partner wants to work and their partner doesn't allow, the other partner doesn't allow the other person to work. Or if they do work, they take all of their family income and
mm,
they keep that family income and not allow the other partner to access family income, or does not talk about how finances are going to be spent or split in the family, and hiding finances, right? A lot of times we see many families struggling because the other partner is not providing, and sending finances back home, or secretly keeping away finances without letting the other partner know. So there's a lot of those things that come up,
mm.
which is not okay.
How does like healthy finances look in a Muslim relationship? Because I know there are concepts of like women can keep their own money and men are providing for the family. So how do you kind of like frame that?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, right? Because they're like, what's the Islamic way of looking at this, right? And so I'm definitely not a scholar at
Yes.
all, but I think let's come back to the concept of communication and safety, right? Let's come back to that, because I think any conversation, whether it be budgeting, whether it be about any other things going on in the relationship, if we're talking about it and having a respectful discussion about it, it's safe and okay,
Yeah.
right? But if we're being dishonest and hiding things and not being transparent, then that's not healthy and that's not okay.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I understand that, because I feel like a lot of times for me, I'm thinking, oh, both the Islamic way, but like we know as a community, there are certain rulings, and then using those rulings through appropriate and good communication is what's important, because things can be misused. Any information can be
Absolutely.
misused. Just knowing, like, as I just said, oh, off the top of my head, oh, the man provides and the woman keeps her money. These things, and then that can be misused or used
Yes.
appropriately.
And we have to understand that as the times are changing, right? And it's with inflation is what I was going to look
Yeah.
for, right? Things can look very different for each family. So
Exactly.
oftentimes, many people will say, well, my family looks this way. Am I doing something wrong or doing something bad, right?
Yeah.
It's just that it's expensive. The world is really expensive. And so if your family looks a certain way, there's nothing wrong or bad to feel about that. It's as long as you're all on the same page and you're being respectful to each other around finances, we're good to go.
Exactly. Exactly. How can you say people can like identify unhealthy dynamics, and where can someone start with that?
Absolutely. So I have a list that I created. So
Yeah.
I think we can go over that, and these are just some quick things to check. So in unhealthy relationship, there's control. So one partner makes all the decisions and tells the other person what to do, or tells the other person what to wear, or
Hmm.
who to spend time with. There may be some physical abuse. We talked a little bit about that. Disrespect. So one partner makes fun of the opinions and interests of the other person, or he or she may destroy something that belongs to the other partner. There could also be intimidation. So one person tries to control every aspect of the other's life,
Mm.
who they meet, and keeping their family from other people. Or they may threaten violence or breakup. Sexual abuse, we talked a little bit about that, and dependence. So one partner feels that he or she can't live without the other. So that's
Oh,
also part of a red flag in relationships.
dependence. That's what
Dependence.
dependence.
So
Okay.
if you leave me, I'm going to die, or I'm going to hurt myself, or I'm going to do something that's really
Yeah.
bad, right? How am I going to survive on my own if you leave me, right? We hear that a
Oh,
lot.
that's really scary. Yeah. It's a
Yeah,
way to kind of control someone to stay.
absolutely. Or he or
Yeah.
she may threaten to do something drastic if the relationship ends. So they'll say,
Yeah.
I'm going to go um, do something absolutely absurd, right, to
Mm.
myself or someone else if you leave me. That's not okay.
Because that's putting the responsibility of the action onto the other person in a sense,
Yes.
or even though it's not their responsibility, they're going to feel guilty for it. Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a big red flag in a relationship, especially early on, I think when you get married or when you're in the talking stages, is that if you ever at any point feel like you're walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting the other person, and you can't say certain things or do certain things because it's going to upset the other person, that's a big red flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And teasing is a big part of our cultural community, Pakistani cultural community.
Yeah.
Making fun of the other person. Things are not funny if we're hurting the other person by making remarks.
Exactly.
So it's really important to early on catch those things and say, hey, that's not funny, or that's not okay, please don't make those jokes.
Yeah.
And dishonesty. So one partner lies to or keeps information from the other, or they may steal from the other person.
Yeah. It's sometimes I think about these and I'm like, oh, they feel like little things, but it's actually the little things that add up and have
Yes.
such a huge impact. The way that someone can respond to a very small action
Yeah.
is just showing what's going to happen in like the bigger actions too. So I feel like it's true that it's not just a little thing. It's okay for you to feel like, oh, I didn't like XYZ. I'm going to put up a boundary. And I think that's what it comes down to, is like having boundaries is that's a conversation that, when do we even have this conversation in our community, right? But like setting boundaries is about, this is how I want to be treated. XYZ happened. And in the future, we cannot let this happen again, or there will be consequences. So
Hmm.
that's like, I think setting that and saying, well, I don't want to be name called. And if we're going to be name calling, then I can't have or maintain that conversation. It's like, it's real. It's like, this is a real thing to say, because a little like name calling can actually become really big in the future.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah.
And then when those things happen, a lot of times there's minimizing and denying and blaming, right? Well, you did X, Y, and Z that made me call you that name,
Yeah.
right? Or it's not a big deal. Like I just called you a female dog, right? That's not a big deal. No, that is a big deal, right?
Mhm.
It's not okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's really, I think it just having these kind of conversations and talking about it gives it the power that it deserves. That, there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, this is not okay. And especially the dependency one, wow, that really hit me. Like, someone can almost manipulate a situation,
Hmm.
and like almost force the person to stay, because they just don't want, like, they know exactly how to get that person to stay, because they will feel that guilt forever,
Yeah.
that, oh, because I left, they hurt themselves or they hurt other people.
Absolutely, and that's why it's really important in this scenario to really judge things by a case by case basis.
Yeah.
I can't say as a therapist or and a social worker, okay, go and do this
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I would say go reach out for support, some help, see
Yeah.
a social worker, see someone, a professional, and talk about your case, what's going on,
Mhm.
and that is when we can provide you some support and hold your hand through this. No one is going to come and save you from it, but we can help you through it, navigate it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's beautifully said.
Yeah.
Abdullah. So we have a few questions from the audience,
Sure.
inshallah,
Yeah.
and we'll take them now.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. So before we take the questions, I just want to bring on the screen a way for folks to reach Sister Kulsum. So we have her, let me just maximize it here so everyone can see clearly, is the Instagram handle. So it's Kulsum Cares, at Kulsum Cares. So maybe if you just want to talk about a bit of the services you provide and what you offer, so inshallah.
Sure, I can absolutely talk about that. So, I'm a social worker and psychotherapist, and I run a group practice with 5 other therapists as well. So, we provide virtual counseling services for people who experience anxiety, depression. We also have a therapist who does couples counseling as well. So
Mm.
lots of different services available, and they're all virtual. And so the reason I started a private practice was because I wanted to make therapy accessible, and for clients to not spend too much money out of pocket. So what we do is we offered a lot of direct billing options, and we have partnerships with different insurance companies. So that way, clients can just show up to therapy and not pay too much out of pocket. So that was one of the reasons I
Awesome.
had started it.
Awesome. So you have other therapists who work with you and also a couples counselor as well.
Yes,
Oh, that's very
absolutely.
cool. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, mashallah.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. So, it was interesting you started off with surviving versus thriving because we actually had a workshop here yesterday with Sheikh Abdullah Misra and Sister Sadia Khan, who's a psychotherapist, and it was called Surviving Marriage, Surviving the Early Years of Marriage. And I actually went back and forth with him a lot, and I'm like, Sheikh, why are we calling it surviving? Let's actually call it thriving in marriage, right?
Yeah.
Because but he's obviously a counselor. He sees a lot of community, and he beautifully explained why he's calling it surviving marriage, and I wouldn't be able to do it justice, but he did sort of say there is an element of surviving before it becomes thriving. And obviously he made it clear he's not talking about surviving abuse or tolerating
Yeah.
abuse. But one of the things that came out of that workshop that was obvious, because there was a lot of people that weren't married there, and alhamdulillah, it's great that we're having these conversations, we're building awareness. But on the flip side, it was obvious from a workshop, there's a sense of fear of getting into relationships, of getting into halal relationships by going to nikah. So as great as these conversations are, I think they're scaring people also.
Mhm.
So what would you say to sort of those maybe younger people, unmarried people, that they hear these conversations, and alhamdulillah we're building awareness, but at the same time now they're questioning, like, why do I want to get into this, right?
Oh, that's a good
Yeah,
question.
that's a really great question. So I would say, our mind, oftentimes when we're reading with these narratives, right, and we're listening to these narratives, it goes to the worst case scenario. This is gonna be me, right? That's really where our mind goes. Like, oh my gosh, this is going to happen to me. So I think it's really important to remember that you are also a person who is developing these things. That they know that they will practice differently. So I know about financial abuse, so I'm going to be a little bit more mindful and have these open conversations before I get married. So I think sometimes when we're in the talking stages, because many of us follow the practice of having a conversation before we get married, versus many of our parents are like, "Here's your person you're getting married to," right? So I think when you're having these conversations, talk about finances, talk about healthy communication styles, talk about what is your attachment style, talk about love languages. Have these open, transparent conversations without shame and without stigma. It's really important to have that. And once you have that, that gives you the skills and confidence to know that this person that I'm getting into this long-term relationship with, right, this marriage with, is a healthy person because of all these things and all these conversations I've had before, versus just jumping into these things without having these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Jazakallah khair for that beautiful answer there. So we did have some questions from the audience. So inshallah, I will display them. We had a lot of comments coming in also. So we have a comment here. Alhamdulillah, very important topic. Jazakallah khair to arrange this podcast. Looking forward to more, inshallah. May Allah reward all of you. Another comment here was saying Jazakallah khair for an amazing topic to benefit our community. There was a question here, or sorry, another, looks like a comment. Sorry, I'm also reading this live.
Yeah, no problem.
Mashallah, thank you for bringing these important topics. Amazing to see Muslim organizations not shove these important topics under the rug.
Thank you.
So alhamdulillah. And then here's a question that came from an audience member saying, are there a moment in the moment
Are
in
there,
the moment steps an individual can take when they receive a comment. So in the moment when they receive a comment that reflects abuse or emotional abuse, are there steps they can take in the moment, especially in the beginning? What internal type of self-talk can prevent someone to accept receiving behaviors that reflect emotional abuse?
So the first one, we talked a little bit about what the question was a little bit about the individual, right? And when they receive a comment. So I would say usually what happens is when people are in the heat of the moment, that's when these comments are coming up, right? And in the heat of the moment, if you're like, don't talk to me that way, right? Or like, that's abuse, you're abusing me. What how are people usually going to respond, right? How dare you call me an abuser, right? Or like, I am not doing that. So, like, there's no space for accountability there, right? So I would say in that moment, especially, so there's especially physical abuse. If someone is hurting or harming you, absolutely remove yourself from that situation. Even emotional abuse, remove yourself from that situation. Take yourself to a safe space. And when things are a little bit calmer, collected, I would say have this conversation with that person. And this is more so for emotional abuse. For physical abuse, if someone's hurting or harming you, please seek safety and call 911, right? That's really important. But with emotional abuse, it's a little bit harder to distinguish. And I would say go to a safe space and until you and regulate yourself, give yourself space to process everything that has happened, and look for a time or space when things are a little bit more grounded to bring these issues up to your partner and say, this is what you said and this is how it made me feel, versus bring it up in that moment because things are very, very heated. But if it's a safety concern, I would say please seek help.
Jazakallah khair. And a question that came in through Instagram was, if I suspect someone is a victim of abuse, but they deny it, what can I do? I'm actually going to step this question back a little, because if I'm reading between the lines here, them denying it means that this person has potentially reached out and had a conversation. But what do I find oftentimes, is especially when people get newly married or something, you notice a complete shift in their personalities. They're not smiling as much as they used to. There might be something going on. And I'm guilty of this too. I'll be the first, and I just don't know how to approach them or ask them, or I don't want to interfere in their business. And then later on, I learned there's something bigger going on, and then I should have been like, I should have stepped in, I should have said something. So if I'm a family member, a friend that notices some of the changes that you talked about, or notices things like that, like, what is my responsibility, first of all, and secondly, how do I approach that person? And then thirdly, the audience question, if they're denying it and refusing to get help, then what do you do? So.
I think each of us have a responsibility for stepping up when we see abuse. We cannot just let it go and say, well, that's their problem, I don't want to get into their business. No, not at all. I think we need to step up and say something until it's too late, and then we cannot live with regret. So I think first thing is to, of course, you're not going to just jump up and say something, but look for a time and place when they are alone. You don't want to approach them with their partner.
Mhm.
So when they're alone, or setting up a time, hey, do you mind if we grab coffee someday, or just go for a walk? Weather's getting nicer, right? Let's go for a walk. Is that okay? I'll come pick you up, right? Um, Connect one on one with that person. Don't just jump into it, right? Build some form of safety, and then say, I've noticed that you haven't been yourself lately, right? What's going on? Yeah, I'm a person that you can trust, so say that to them, reassure them, and have an open conversation of what's going on with them, and then maybe talk about some of the things we talked about today, right? What are the different forms of abuse? I noticed that you had a bruise when you came to prayer on Tuesday. What's about that? What's going on? Right? Or I noticed that, you have been dropping a lot of things lately. You're not focusing on what's going on in front of you. Or, I noticed that you got into a car accident recently. What happened? Right? So
Mhm.
bringing those things like real life examples up of things
Yeah.
that you've noticed, a red flag, and talking about some red flags that are common in abusive relationships, and bringing that up, I think, would be the first step.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jazakallah khair. And then I guess the audience question, if I can just take it a step further,
Yeah.
you talk to someone, you think, but they're, and you maybe even you figure out that they're in sort of an abusive relationship and they admit it, but then they're they're either denying it or they're refusing to get help. They're refusing to sort of hear you. Is there anything you can do at that point, or is it that you just, you've tried and there's nothing much more you can do? So
Yeah, so denial is very common. I would say
Mm.
that's usually the first reaction. It's like, and you know why that many people deny, because they think it's not going to happen again, right? He only slapped me once. Oh, he only threw his phone at me once, or she only hurt me once. So a lot of people will, that's a stage of the cycle of violence. When we look at that, are in denial because they think it's not going to happen again. And we all we can do is continue trying and approaching them and talking to them and being a safe support. Don't abandon people. I think isolation is a worst thing. When someone's going through something like this, people will isolate themselves because they're too embarrassed. They have a lot of shame,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
That's
connect. Yeah.
yeah. The denial I was thinking also it comes from them thinking it's their fault, like
Yep.
the guilt, and they're like, oh, I'm just not gonna stand up then because it's my fault anyways. So other people, if they find out, they're gonna think bad of me.
Yeah.
So it's that whole cycle of like they think it's their fault too. So you can't really do something for them unless they actually do something for themselves.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
And what you can do for them is just show up for them.
Mm,
Stay consistent, stay strong as a friend. Don't give up on them.
yeah. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair. So the next question we had come in was regarding this topic. Why is there a movement to always believe someone that claims abuse? I personally know more than one husband slash father whose lives were destroyed after false claims of abuse.
Mm,
So there has always been a narrative around not believing people who have been abused.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge that first.
yeah.
So for generations and years and years and years, many women have claimed that they've been abused, and people are like, "Well, get over it. Everyone gets abused. It's not a big deal."
Mhm.
Right? And I think that still exists. Unfortunately, and it's to prove abuse, and especially to prove emotional, financial, or sexual abuse, is really hard in the court.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to recognize the historical context of abuse first. And unfortunately, there are false claims of abuse that do happen. But I think something to think about is that it takes a victim a lot of energy and effort to make a false abuse claim. So someone would have to put everything on the table, right, from their end, and want to leave this relationship or have to leave this relationship and then make the claim, right? So we have to understand a little bit of like, why would someone do something like this? But even if they would, right, there are a lot of people who struggle with their mental health issues and may do certain things, right? And or do make false claims. And so when something like that has happened and someone has made a false claim, all they can do is really clarify with people around them that they didn't do such a thing and that their character and morals are okay. And it's just an unfortunate situation. All they can do is get their character intact again and continue doing what they're doing that is healthy and okay, and seek out supports, right? And that can take a huge toll on their mental health, being labeled as an abuser when they're not. I think reaching out to mental health supports, mental health counselors, there are male and female counselors available and therapists available. So reach out to someone and work on yourself, work on how do I move forward when this awful, terrible thing has happened.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate you mentioning that it's been like more so that things are said, oh, this is a false claim. More people have been told this is a false claim. And yes, of course, there is going to be the one or two situations where there is someone speaking up and they're lying or they're saying something wrong. But I don't think we should negate every situation that is someone actually speaking up about abuse and saying, oh, they could be wrong too, because it's the whole concept of like they're you end up having to say, okay, well, we believe them because they're coming out and they're saying this is what's happened to me. It's so hard to even take that first step and say
So
that,
hard.
I've been hurt. So yeah.
Jazakallah khair. So we have another question here that is saying, a family member has been in multiple marriages now where there was abuse. Is there a reason she is prone to this, or is it just bad luck?
Okay. So looking at the question now, and I think
And so, sorry, something I should interrupt
Yeah.
is, and I usually do
Sorry.
this disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah.
Like we get a lot of questions, which like alhamdulillah, they're asking the questions, but they're
Yeah.
very heavy questions that are
Yeah.
case by case and can't be addressed on
Yes.
podcasts. Like we cannot do the question justice without having details of the background and understanding the specifics. So that's just a disclaimer I want to put out there, that obviously we can't answer everything on a podcast. So we do encourage people to reach out. We've provided Sister Kulsum some contact information also. We'll put it up. But yeah, so just a general, if you wanted to respond to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I talk a lot about this in my sessions, where if someone comes from an abusive household, the likelihood that they will be in an abusive relationship is very high. Why? Because they build a tolerance to the abuse. They think slapping, hitting, grabbing, shoving, yelling, withholding finances is okay. It's normal. My dad did it. My mom did it. So it should be okay, right? And so many people choose partners based on what they see at home, and unfortunately end up in these relationships over and over again until they seek help, right? So it's really important if you find someone is ending up in these relationships, that they seek help, and they can seek help for several reasons. First, they can look at what's going on. Is there certain behaviors that I'm attracted to or that I think is okay and it's not? And something else that they can do is they can build some self-awareness about what are some behaviors that I have that can also be problematic. Like some introspection work is also helpful. So I'm not here to like say know exactly what they can do, but I think it is by case basis. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair. So the next question, sorry, I'm not gonna display it on the screen just to protect the privacy and maybe so I'll have to read it out and you'll have to follow along.
Okay.
So what is asked, or maybe you can see it
Yeah,
there
we
on
can
the
see
side.
it.
So what steps should someone take who is in an abusive marriage for 25 years, taking in all forms of these abuse when other partner constantly does not find nothing wrong in themselves?
So I would say if things haven't changed in 25 years, the likelihood that things are going to change in the next 25 are very, very low, right? So I think reach out for help, because people, if they don't want to change, they're not going to change, right? So reach out to help and see what you can do for yourself. I think that people underestimate how much of an impact an abusive relationship can take on you. And I'm not saying separating and divorce and living on your own is easy, but what's really important is that you're alive, because many homicides happen in abusive households. Unfortunately, we've lost many sisters in abusive relationships, countless sisters. I've been following uh, a researcher who has looking into that in Muslim families and domestic violence. And unfortunately, that is on the rise, and we have to be careful, and we have to make sure that we're keeping our sisters safe. So your safety is of paramount importance. So for you to be healthy, okay, and alive is really important for us. So please seek out support. And like I mentioned earlier, NISA helpline. I think maybe we can attach their information as well when they're somewhere,
Yeah,
if
absolutely. And this so
possible.
NISA helpline on NISA Homes and one organization now, NISA Foundation. We've actually had their executive director Yasmin Yusuf on,
Good.
and she'll be back March. You'll have to follow our Instagram, but March 7th, I believe, is the date. March 10th, she'll be back to also talk about what NISA offers and what they do.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yes.
And Sakina Homes as well.
Yeah.
Sakina
Yeah.
Homes we've had on also, absolutely. So so one final question from myself, maybe. I know we touched upon it a little bit, where men can also be victims of abuse, and inshallah, that's, I think, is a whole podcast on its own also. And I hate to bring Hollywood into like a Islamic type conversation, but recently there was the trial of Johnny Depp and his girlfriend, wife. I'm not sure if they were married, but there was a recording that was played, and I thought honestly it was a chilling, groundbreaking moment, where in the recording she was mocking him, like, tell the world, Johnny, tell the world that you, a man, are a victim of domestic violence, that you're a victim. Like, she was daring him to tell the world, and he said, yes, I am. So what sort of, I don't want to distract from the conversation too much. This is a loaded topic podcast on our own. But if there's any men that are listening that may be sort of victims of abuse, what sort of message would you sort of leave them with? Um, and again, I know it's a loaded question and a bigger conversation, but is there a message for them to?
Excellent point. I think I would say it does not make you less of a man to seek out support. And there is no shame at all to say, hey, I've experienced domestic violence. There are countless Muslim therapists out here who will keep your information confidential and support you in navigating this difficult circumstance. Reach out for support. There is absolutely no shame, no judgment. You're not alone. Please reach out for support. We're here for you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. That's great. And with that in mind, I will once again just display. So it's at Kulsum Cares on Instagram. Is there like an email address in case someone doesn't have Instagram?
Sure, yeah.
Or?
I think there should be an email button there that someone can message, or they can click on the link tree and go on my website.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, so inshallah, everyone, they wanted to learn more and see. One thing I forgot to mention also is that I'm assuming, because we are in Ontario here,
Yeah.
and you are a registered psychotherapist, that
Social worker.
social worker.
Registered
So
yeah.
sorry, my mistake. That a lot of this would be covered by private insurance. Is that correct, or?
Yeah, so I'm a therapist in Ontario, and my team all practices in Ontario, and so we would be covered by private insurance through workplace usually, or school, in Ontario.
Yeah, so that's just the point I want to make, because a lot of people don't realize this. Like, at their work coverage would actually cover a lot of this, inshallah. So
Yes.
take advantage of that. It's a resource we have available. These insurance companies are billion-dollar industries, because a lot of this coverage is going unused, right? So better than them having it, let's put it back into the Muslim community. And I encourage everyone to look into, if they have private coverage at work, look into it and see if, inshallah, a lot of these services are covered. And as Munta pointed out, Canadian Muslim Counseling is another one. Imam Umar Patel, who's been on the podcast before, Sheikh Abdullah Misra, who was here yesterday, is also a part of that. So going back to the conversation about men, there's also a lot of male Muslim therapists. Maybe 10 years ago there wasn't, but now I'm seeing that's growing and growing, and we've had a lot on the show also. So please reach out, and it may also be covered. And even if it's not covered, alhamdulillah, I've seen the generosity of these people, the generosity of Sister Kulsum being here. Like, no one is going to turn someone away that needs help, and they will, inshallah, get the help they seek. So Munta,
Exactly.
I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Brother Kashif. Sister Kulsum, do you have one takeaway for our audience today? I know it's a very heavy topic, but as a lot of the comments came in, it's very important that we discuss. So, what's one thing that you can kind of get the audience to take away from today?
So if I can get you to take anything away, it would be you are not alone. You have supports. If you are experiencing abuse, reach out for help. Tell someone that's safe and that's okay. Um, for you, that you feel comfortable with, that you are experiencing abuse. We will help you or find someone to help you through this and navigate this circumstance. So please, there's no shame.
Jazakallah khair. We really appreciate having you on our podcast, Sister Kulsum. Jazakallah khair, Brother Kashif, for all the amazing questions that you bring through, you ask, and all the producing. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. See everyone next week.